Very excited to have two new guests on the podcast today. First of all, Sharif Hanna. We've been chatting for a little while now about the power of C2PA, and over at Google, you are the C2PA product lead. And then I've also got Isaac Reynolds. You are director of product management on the Pixel camera. So you are exactly the people I would like to talk to about data verification in the modern age, how Google is thinking about this in general, and kind of how you see the future of tools like C2PA in helping us know how much any image has been edited. So thanks for coming on, you guys.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
And I am definitely going to be playing the kind of naive in this situation because I only have somewhat limited knowledge about exactly what C2PA is. I don't have any cameras that actually support it. So my research is still secondhand, and that's a frustration for me. I want every camera I have to be supporting this because I think it's a very useful tool. And I think even if it evolves over time, we need to get started asking for this kind of thing from more camera manufacturers. And you implemented it on the Google Pixel 10 and 10 Pro. So first of all, if you can just give me in broad strokes, what is C2PA? What does that actually stand for, and what does it do?
Sure. C2PA stands for the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. So it's actually a standards organization. So it's a group of technology companies, news publishers, device makers that have all come together to answer a question, which is, what if every piece of media came with proof of how it was made? And so that's the technology that the C2PA has developed. It's called Content Credentials, and it acts like a passport for a piece of digital media. It tells you its origin, it tells you its journey along the way, if it's straight out of a camera, or if it's been edited along the way, or if it was generated by an AI model, or maybe it started out as something from a camera that was later edited by generative AI, and encodes all of that information in a way that's interoperable, which means that multiple companies across the internet can read this information, validate that it's intact and hasn't been tampered with, and then can display that to users. So that's the best way to think about the technology that C2PA created. It's essentially a way to have verifiable proof of how a piece of media was made.
So it's much more than a feature on the specific camera that you're using. This is an ecosystem. It's part of the reasons that it's great that this is overseen by a committee or a group that is going to have the same rules for everybody, and we have a standard that can move across systems. So Isaac, could you tell me a little bit about how it's implemented on the Google Pixel, especially from a user perspective? Like, how do we experience this when you take a photo with your Pixel?
Yeah. It's important to document the entire history of the image from its creation to all the edits that went through it. So we're the originator of files in Pixel Camera. And so we label every file that we create with its origin, whether that's simply created with a camera, or if we're doing some image merging and blending, or if we're using AI to edit it even in the camera processing. And then we hand that off to the system for later apps to show and decode. So if you're in camera, you're not really seeing C2PA being attached. It's invisible, it's under the hood. It's once you get into apps like Google Photos or even other ecosystem partners that you start to experience those labels. I think we're all familiar with seeing something on the internet, thinking to ourselves, is that AI? Is it not AI? Where did that come from? And you click the three dots menu, or you swipe up and you look for where that might have come from. We're attaching the kind of metadata that shows up in those experiences in social media and sharing applications. So you don't really see it in camera, and that's kind of the point. We just want it attached everywhere all the time, invisibly, for everyone to see later.
I think that something that a lot of photographers have run into as different verification methods have been employed over different social platforms is sometimes kind of being false flagged in a way for, like, this was created with AI. I had a hat that just said made with AI because that was a thing on Instagram for a little while. But it was flagging, even noise removal or some things that are kind of more borderline, like generative fill. Obviously, HDR can be using machine learning as well. How do those different types of features qualify for different types of C2PA? Is there a gradient qualifying all those things, or is it just on or off? Like, how do you know if it was slightly tampered with some AI tools versus actually generated?
The C2PA itself has a very rich vocabulary for communicating exactly that level of detail. That's actually one of the greatest powers of the standard of content credentials, is this ability to have this very detailed list of, all kinds of transformations that have happened. So in some of the examples that Isaac brought up, using content credentials attached by the camera. And then let's say if that photo is opened in Google Photos and edited, let's say using Magic Editor or Magic Eraser or something like that, we're able to tell from the C2PA content credential that it did start out as a photo from a camera and was then brought into Google Photos. And then these types of edits are applied. And there's a vocabulary for standard operations like cropping, adjusting color, doing enhancements like noise reduction. And there's also a way to indicate whether generative AI was involved in that particular either creation action or the editing action as well. So the standard actually supports encoding all of this information. And then it's up to, the platforms that are receiving this information to decode this and surface it properly. But the level of detail is actually available if the generator product, so like the cameras or camera apps or the editing tools, they do have that rich vocabulary that they can use to encode that information in detail.
I mean, there are a number of other camera manufacturers that have slowly started to implement this. I know Leica, Nikon, Sony, and Fuji's at least talked about it, are getting started with it, but it's not everywhere yet. And it feels kind of the same with the platforms. For this to really be functional, we kind of need a pretty broad support. Where could I see examples of this in some online platforms? Like, is there, if I kind of want to see the best representation of like, here's how it's documented, or here's the state of how we communicate this verification language to the public, where can I see that in my own images?
Yeah, so there are some examples already out there. So for example, if you were to go generate a video in the Gemini app using Veo, and then you take that video and upload it to TikTok, for example, TikTok will read the C2PA content credential and will understand that it's a fully synthetic video and will label it as such. And then on the other side, if you go generate a video with Sora and you were to upload it to YouTube, YouTube will be able to read the C2PA content credential and label it accordingly. So some of that work is already ongoing, but I would say that a lot of the implementations so far have anchored on detecting the involvement of AI and labeling according to that. And we, I think, have a vision for not just labeling based on AI, but even labeling, let's say, something that came straight from a camera or came from a camera and, let's say, was edited using non-AI tools, and this, in the age when we're trying to figure out, where a lot of people have the question of, the nature of what they're seeing online. We think that this is the natural next step, and it's what we have done in Google Photos. So if you go to Google Photos and somebody sent you a photo and if it has content credentials, it will expose all of that information to you, whether AI was involved or not. If there's valid C2PA information there, it will show it to you. And maybe tossing it over to Isaac, like to provide an example of what the Google Photos experience for a pixel camera capture looks like.
Yeah, it's easy to get to. The same way you go into Google Photos and you swipe up to see all the information, time, date, exposure, ISO, those sorts of things. Right underneath all that existing information is a panel that says basically how this media was created, and it's got the content credentials logo right there, so you know where it's from. And it'll tell you what device was used to create it. In this case, it's a Google Pixel camera, and it'll tell you whether it was created with a camera, then edited with AI, because we do apply some AI models directly in the camera, and we want to show the difference between that origin and what was done to it later. And then there are composites. So we'll take multiple images and we'll blend different moments in time into one. We call those created with a camera. I'm sorry, it's not even created with a camera. It's just composite. It's created from a composite of camera images. So you see that in that panel. Very clear text right there. And that's the same kind of text and information that's transmitted everywhere you share that image. You mentioned something interesting. It's kind of an ecosystem. I agree that it's an ecosystem. We call these kind of two-faced problems because there's a producer, which is a kind of a camera or a generator, and then a consumer, which is like a social media or a sharing app. And kind of somebody has to go first. It's right. Otherwise, no one ever goes at all, right? So we thought it was really important to generate as much content as we possibly could to get it out into the world and kickstart that ecosystem from our side. And that's why so many Google products are embedding this kind of metadata into as much as they possibly can, right? It's not just the images that were made with AI that camera's attaching it to. We're attaching it to every image even the overwhelming majority that are just made with a camera.
Well, and it's why I think it's actually more important for this to happen on mobile cameras first, on phones, because it just documents so much more of our world in reality. I think, the camera manufacturers so far have focused on their more like reportage cameras that are used by journalists, which it makes sense, right? Of course, the BBC, I think, uses some amount of, shows the validation as well. But most of what we see is captured on a phone. So the sooner that this can spread across all phones, I just think we're all going to be better off. This is where we want it to be. One thing I don't really know about is how does it work differently on images, video, and then also audio? Because obviously all of these things can be synthetic or not. Is it similar? How does that work?
Yeah, so you can embed C2PA content credentials into all sorts of media types. So images, videos, audio files, even documents, PDF documents, Word documents, essentially a growing number of different media formats. But of course, everybody's mind goes to the, images initially and then video and audio. So already, if you record, for example, an audio recording with Pixel Recorder, it will have a C2PA content credential saying it's an actual audio recording from a microphone, as opposed to being a synthetic audio generation. So yeah, it works for those media types. And essentially, what the C2PA organization has figured out is ways to stuff this metadata in a consistent way across different media formats, so that it doesn't change the compatibility of the file. It doesn't break, let's say, the ability for an application that doesn't understand C2PA should not break if it encounters a file that has C2PA content credentials inside. So the organization has figured out how to do that for a wide variety of different file formats. And the vocabulary for communicating how the file was created and how it was edited can be applied to any type of media file.
I'm just going to say that I'm always so close to thinking of it as a Star Wars droid and calling it CP2A or well, I'm always this close to getting it wrong every time I say it. So obviously this is only, it only works as well as it can be trusted. I'm sure since you guys have put a lot of effort behind it, you see it as a valid source of truth. How is there no concern that it could be spoofed, that people could take synthetic photos, videos and attach their own validation to it somehow? How do we know, especially as non-technical hobbyists or professionals, how do we know that the actual verification is trustworthy?
There's a number of controls that are in place for that. The C2PA itself has what is called a conformance program. And the point behind the conformance program is very similar to, let's say, the Wi-Fi logo or the Bluetooth logo. The idea that somebody's building a new product, they actually submit it to the organization to test it, that it implemented the standard correctly, and that, gives you assurance that if you buy this thing that says it works with Wi-Fi, you bring it home, it's actually going to be able to connect to your Wi-Fi network. Very, very similar with the C2PA. So the C2PA conformance program established a set of requirements for both making sure that the implementation is done correctly. So it's encoding all of the information properly. It's following all of the rules of the spec itself. And then the security of the implementation, which is very important. So here we're talking about the use of cryptographic keys to digitally sign, data. The management of cryptographic keys is fundamental to trust in the entire system. And therefore, there are rigorous requirements around how the handling of cryptographic keys has to go. And that's mandated by the C2PA, and you submit your implementation to the C2PA. They evaluate it, and then they decide whether there's essentially a third-party auditor that decides whether you've met the security requirements or not. And another aspect of this is that there are actually differentiated levels of assurance, as they're called, right? Because any security problem that you have, there's no such thing as perfect security. There's only the level of effort that would be required to defeat the system. And so the C2PA itself defines multiple levels of security effectively. And Pixel Camera actually achieves the highest level currently defined by the C2PA. And I can turn it over to Isaac to maybe comment on, the Pixel specific implementation and how we were able to get there on Pixel devices.
Yeah, it was actually a privilege doing it with Sharif because Sharif is a security expert for a long time and I'm a camera expert. And so there were a lot of security questions that I had to send back to Sharif. How's this done? How does this operating system check this? How does that attestation work? And you should have seen the paperwork we submitted to C2PA about how it's implemented. It was a lot of documentation. It was certainly more documentation, I think, than I've ever shared outside the company for any feature we've ever built. Was what we wrote up about that for the conformance program. So it was a really interesting experience. I learned a lot about security, but some of the core components run actually inside the protected components of Tensor, both the hardware components and the software components. There are ways to run things on your phone that are more or less protected, and we run a lot of these important pieces in the more protected parts. There's a secure clock, for example. It's really important that you know when something was created, or at least know that it was not created after a certain moment in time. So we actually run a secure offline clock with some accuracy guarantees. Yeah.
Can I ask a really basic question about that? If I just change the time on my phone, there's no way around it, right? I mean, obviously you've thought about this, but
yeah, what it actually does is it doesn't. I don't even think it depends on your carrier. So you can't spoof it with that kind of professional equipment. It doesn't depend on your Wi-Fi setting or your anything like that. It actually pings a trusted server, and the server signs and encrypts a timestamp and sends it back to the phone. And then that initializes a clock that runs inside a secure hardware component on your phone. And that clock then runs and checks in periodically to resync itself. But that whole clock has its own security guarantees and its own accuracy guarantees that were all documented and shared. And that's just one of the subcomponents of trying to get the security right. There was a whole other component that is simply making sure that you're running trusted code all the way from top to bottom. Pixel is a fairly open device. If you want to be a developer and install interesting operating systems, you certainly can. But the phone is aware that that's happening. It knows that it's no longer running trusted code provided from a trusted source, from a trusted developer that was signed on a trusted computer. So all that stuff gets also verified by a server, another trusted server, and a whole other process called attestation to make sure the device is secure. It's running code that we understand and have documented, all the way from the camera application, all the way down to the operating system and kernel.
Cool. Well, and obviously the pipeline extends outside of the camera itself. A lot of images that are trustworthy are also edited. So I know Adobe has picked up a lot of this as well. Obviously this isn't something you designed, but just so that photographers kind of know what they're working with, how does the next step in the pipeline work if you do have some edits to do in your images?
Yeah, so this is where the growing number of applications that support the standards is very important. Adobe has been, one of the founding members of the organization itself, and they've worked very diligently to integrate the technology into their product. So, yeah, if you capture something on Pixel Camera, you open in Photoshop or Lightroom, you do further edits, Photoshop or Lightroom will record the list of edits that were done and then sign over that, so that we're adding a new record, right, to the history, to the story of the piece of content, and then you export that out, and then you can share it online. So yeah, at least the Adobe tools are there, and then there's a growing list of other tools that are coming on board. There's actually a website that I can share with you after that lists all of the conforming products, essentially all of the products that have passed through, this rigorous process that Isaac mentioned, including some editing tools, as well, in addition to, I would say, generation tools like, camera apps.
Well, it's easy for me to imagine how this might work with photography, but on the video side, most videos I post have been edited because I'm cutting them and combining them. Is there a way to do it there as well? Because obviously they've been modified quite a bit.
Yeah, Premiere supports content credentials as well. So let's say, well, at this point, Pixel Camera only supports still images. But let's say that you were to use one of those still images, bring it into Premiere as part of the composition, right, for the video. That information can carry forward in the exported one if you choose to attach content credentials as well.
The way that I always hope that this could work when I'm posting my own work is that I can almost have like a, score out of 100 of how much this was modified. Because often it's like I removed a light switch in the background or some reflections. I would rather everybody know 10% of this image is slightly shifted, because for me, maybe that's the average. It's maybe between 5 and maybe 25% if I let's say, add a blue sky to what was otherwise a cloudy day. That's probably the biggest change that I'll make that anybody would see. And I would rather everybody always know that that's the modification that happens. And I guess this is just me making a comment about what I would like to see. Obviously, that's less up to you guys to implement, because I just have had those images that people are like, this looks like AI. And it's so hard to say, well, it's not, take my word for it. But, once we can kind of put a stamp on it and say, well, this little bit was touched up and that's all. That'd be great.
The standard itself actually supports encoding, not so much a percentage, but, you can say that this edit action, let's say this generative, erase and fill action, only applied to this pixel boundary inside the image. Or if it's in a video, that inside this pixel boundary across, from timestamp X to timestamp Y. So the spec actually supports that. The question becomes, do we collectively as an industry, want to put in the effort to both encode this information and then figure out how to render it to the user in the end so that it's comprehensible and doesn't overwhelm them, and also doesn't give them the wrong impression, because changing 5% of the image may be changing the most semantically important aspect.
Most important 5%, of course.
Maybe the most important, there was a, gun in the back table, right? Or there isn't. Yeah, it's tiny, right? In the image, but it changes the meaning of the image substantially. So that's why I think that this type of thing has been contemplated in terms of how do we tell people, the nature of what was changed, but continues to be a pretty tricky problem given the fact that size does not necessarily correspond with the importance of, or the significance of the change. However, minimally, I think for, let's say, the scenario that you brought up, you'd be able to tell that it did start out, as a camera creation. And then there were edits that were applied, right? And if the history of the recorded edits is rich enough, people would, be able to see that, let's say, it's not the entire thing that was generated, wholesale from AI. That's something that the technology can solve today, as implemented.
Google has obviously been leaning into a lot of interesting AI tools that we're not even seeing anywhere else. And I think having the C2PA support behind you, knowing that it's been so thoroughly taken care of, can kind of give you some confidence that there's always that clearer line between the two. Like, how do you think about the AI tools that are in the Pixel camera, knowing that there is kind of C2PA in the background supporting you?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think awareness of AI is really, really high. Concern about AI is really, really high. And I think it's actually pushing upward the value of content that was created with a camera rather than with AI. People want to see camera content more and more. Now, as for whether it's a clear line in the sand, I'm not sure I would say it like that. Unfortunately, I don't know, for better or for worse, there are 1,000 different ways to tune an AI algorithm. That's why there are 1,000 AI algorithms and features launched at Google. So it's still a case-by-case basis whether this is edited with AI or made with AI or belongs in Google Photos as an editing feature versus belongs in the camera as a default feature versus an opt-in feature versus an opt-out feature versus, all the various ways to ship things. So I don't know that it makes it more comfortable. I think everything is always going to be tuned and prepared very case-by-case bespoke. But I do think as we see the value of made with a camera content increase, I don't think that makes us necessarily more willing to put AI directly in the camera. I think it makes us more willing to look after authenticity and to do C2PA labeling more completely and more accurately and with an even higher security bar over the years potentially. So I don't know that it makes it easier. It's just another consideration that we go through when we evaluate any feature.
Well, and I know even before generative AI had fully arrived, back when we were just starting to see shapes come out of computers, there was already concern about people, like the mainstream assumption was sometimes that just basic HDR features that used machine learning couldn't be trusted, which I just find it interesting. Like, we've had this problem even before it was as challenging as it is right now. So obviously the amount that we need to educate the public about it, communicate how these tools really work, and, hopefully not overcomplicate them. I mean, I think most people that didn't listen to this episode will never become familiar with the letters C2PA, which is fine. But that, the more that they understand that there is a way of having more or less confidence in the sources of their imagery, I think that's going to be a positive thing moving forward. What would success look like for you guys in the future? Like, how do you hope this evolves? How do you see this evolving in the next few years?
I would say I would really love for the platforms where the content ends up showing up to be more bold about embracing the technology. I think on the production side, we probably launched more C2PA enabled products in a couple of quarters than the rest of the ecosystem has in a couple of years. So we're very committed to this. And we would like to see the rest of the ecosystem embrace it more fully and not shy away from, let's say, telling somebody that, Pixel Camera is claiming that this is a photograph that hasn't been edited since it was taken, right? There's I would say a certain level of discomfort of passing through something like that because you don't want people to misunderstand what that means, right? Just because it came out of a camera, does that mean that the scene itself is true? No, that's not correct. So I think there's been some maybe good caution, right, around embracing the ability to be able to tell that something came from a camera and label that. So I would say that I would love to see the ecosystem embrace that challenge and figure out ways to convey this information safely to users and help them understand. And then to use this in addition to some of the other tools that we have. So, we have SynthID watermarking. We apply that to all of our synthetic content. That one is indelible. You can't remove it with a screenshot. It's not metadata. It stays with the content wherever it goes. And we give people now the ability in the Gemini app to upload a piece of content and ask the question, was this made with Google AI?
I always just find that so interesting to think about how screenshotting can still preserve the actual stamp in there, which is obviously beyond my pay grade. I don't know how that stuff works, but it's really cool.
The signal is actually embedded into the very pixels themselves, or when it comes to an audio file, into the very audio waveform. And so it's very, very resilient. It's operating on a completely different, mental model to C2PA, right? C2PA is proof positive. Like we said, it's a passport. You can shred a passport, you can lose it, but there are situations when you're passing through, a security check line, right, at an airport, well, you will need it, right? But SynthID is operating on a different model. It's sticks to the content, right? As much as possible, even small manipulations don't impact it. And we've added the ability for people to interrogate that. So that's another thing I think that the rest of the industry can do is figure out ways to enable users to interrogate the content that was created using their own tools, right? And it's something that we are working behind the scenes with the rest of the ecosystem to try to figure out the best ways possible to maybe figure out how to bring all these systems together and make them work together better to serve people.
And I'm going to add one thing to Sharice's list, if that's okay, which is by the time this episode airs, we're going to have launched content credentials on the Pixel 9 series as well. So we're still adding new launches to the ecosystem. The other thing I'd like to say is I actually want to challenge you, Tyler, a little bit, because you said maybe no one will ever need to know about this and that's okay. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's true. We do want people to know about these labels. We want to bifurcate the world not into AI and not AI, because that's not a real bifurcation. That's actually a trick. That's a trap. The real bifurcation is labeled and not labeled, where the labeled content is generally more trustworthy, and the unlabeled content is where you should be more suspicious. So I think this is a basic digital literacy item. Right? When I was in school, very young, I learned about HTTPS and the difference between visiting a .gov site and a .com site. And maybe someday content credentials will be part of basic digital literacy that we teach in schools. I think that'd be wonderful. I think people should know about it.
Sure. Yeah, I know what you mean. And, I think it can also become a tool in raising the value of content that hasn't been modified. Like there will be tons of enjoyable AI content out there that it's going to fill our social media. It's going to be all over the place. Some of it's going to be terrible. Some of it will be good and enjoyable, but there will be something kind of special about when you see a level of certification. You're like, okay, I know something about that image. Doesn't tell you the whole story, but tells you a little bit more. And I'd like to see more of it. To me, this is part of why film photography has also been on the rise, is because people are craving this sense of like, I don't know everything, but I know this feels a little more tangible than some of the other media that I'm looking at.
The other thing that we worked really, really hard on for the camera was privacy. A lot of immediate reactions about these labels are, oh, it's signed. Is that my signature? Am I now apparently identified on all my pictures? That's not what's going on. We actually had to do a lot of work to make sure that there was no way for you to link two images to one another in a new way that wasn't already possible, or to make sure that even some of the servers and attestation processes involved couldn't identify you. So it is totally privacy preserving. You should never have to worry about whether your images from Pixel Camera have this stuff attached at all. It's completely safe to have, and we worked really hard on that too. Well,
that's very good to know. And I appreciate your time and digging into this big, important, tough topic. So Sharif, Isaac, thanks for joining me. And hopefully I'll have a review of the next Pixel phone and we can come back again and dive in even deeper.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
If you want more of this, check us out on all the social platforms at Full Stack Creator Show. And if you want to learn how to make thumbnails that get clicks, check out David's thumbnailacademy.com. Or if you want beautiful LUTs and Lightroom presets for your photos and videos, head to stallman.com/shop.